The first time Pearl Kincaid saw the ranch auction list on the community board, her heart sank like a stone in the river running through Park City, Utah. Her father's property, all 40 acres of it, would be on the auction block in 30 days, unless she could raise enough money to clear the debt that had mounted after his passing. It was 1885, and Park City had changed dramatically in the 15 years since silver was discovered in the hills. What had once been a quiet settlement was now a bustling mining town, with newcomers arriving daily seeking their fortunes. Pearl, at 22, had lived there all her life, watching the transformation with mixed feelings. The prosperity had brought opportunity, but it had also brought men who saw the land as nothing but a commodity to be bought, sold, and exploited. Pearl stood in front of Emmett's general store, reading the notice for the third time, her fingers trembling. Her mother had died during childbirth, and her father had raised her alone, teaching her everything about ranching: how to mend fences, how to birth calves, how to ride as well as any man. Now she was on her own, and the banker, Harold Townsend, seemed determined to take everything she had left. "Bad news, Miss Kincaid?" Mayor Fletcher asked, stepping up beside her. His voice carried a note of false sympathy that made Pearl's skin crawl. "Nothing I can't handle," she replied, her chin lifting defiantly. The mayor chuckled, the sound like leather stretching too tight. "Of course. Though I imagine it's quite a burden for a young lady like yourself. Perhaps you ought to consider Mr. Townsend's offer to buy the property directly. Save yourself the embarrassment of a public auction." Pearl turned to face him. "My father built that ranch from nothing, Mayor Fletcher. I don't intend to hand it over to anyone, especially not Harold Townsend." "Admirable spirit," the mayor said with a condescending smile. "But sentiment won't pay your debts, my dear." As Pearl walked away, she could feel the eyes of townspeople on her back. Most of them had already written her off as a failure. A woman couldn't run a ranch alone, they whispered. It was only a matter of time before she lost everything. 2 days later, Pearl was hauling water to the cattle trough when she heard hoofbeats approaching. She straightened, wiping her brow with the back of her hand. A stranger rode toward the ranch house, his silhouette sharp against the setting sun. He was tall in the saddle, with broad shoulders and a black Stetson pulled low over his face. As he drew closer, Pearl could make out more details: a strong jaw dusted with stubble, intense blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once, and a confidence set to his shoulders that spoke of a man who knew his own worth. "Afternoon, madam," he said, tipping his hat politely. "Name's Lucas Ward. I'm looking for work." Pearl surveyed him skeptically. "What kind of work?" "Ranch hand. Heard in town you might be hiring." Pearl almost laughed. "You heard wrong, Mr. Ward. I can barely afford to feed myself and the cattle, let alone pay wages." Lucas dismounted, his movements fluid and practiced. "Maybe we could come to an arrangement. I need a place to stay. You need help." "What I need is $300 to save this place from auction," Pearl said bluntly, not bothering to hide the bitterness in her voice. Lucas's eyebrows rose slightly. "300? That's quite a sum." "My father took out a loan last year to get us through the drought. I've been trying to pay it back," but Pearl stopped herself, wondering why she was telling this stranger her troubles. Lucas looked around the property with a calculating gaze. "Your place has potential. Good water access, decent grazing land." "I know what my ranch is worth, Mr. Ward." "Lucas," he corrected, "and I don't doubt it. Question is, do the folks in town know?" Pearl stared at him, something in his words striking a chord. "Most of them are just waiting for me to fail so they can buy the land cheap at auction, especially Harold Townsend." "Banks have a way of creating opportunities for themselves," Lucas said, his voice hardening slightly. "Tell you what. I'll work for you for a month, no wages, just food and a place to sleep. If we can save your ranch, we can discuss more permanent arrangements. Pearl narrowed her eyes. Why would you do that? Lucas's mouth quirked in a half-smile. Let's just say I've seen too many good people lose their land to men who only see dollar signs. Besides, he added, his eyes twinkling, I do enjoy proving people wrong. Against her better judgment, Pearl found herself agreeing. She had nothing to lose. The ranch was already slipping through her fingers. That evening, as they sat at the worn kitchen table, eating a simple meal of beans and cornbread, Pearl studied her new ranch hand. There was something about Lucas Ward that didn't quite fit the typical drifter mold. His hands showed calluses from hard work, but his speech was educated, and his manner suggested he was used to giving orders, not taking them. "Where are you from?" she asked. "All over," he replied vaguely. "Spent some time in Texas, Colorado, up in Montana Territory." "And what brings you to Park City?" Lucas took a sip of coffee before answering. "Heard there were opportunities. Mining's booming, ranches changing hands. Seemed like a good place to find work." Pearl wasn't satisfied with his answer, but she didn't press. Everyone in the West had a past they preferred not to discuss. The next morning, Lucas was up before dawn, already repairing the broken corral fence when Pearl stepped outside. She watched him work for a moment, his movements efficient and precise. Perhaps having him around wouldn't be such a mistake after all. They fell into a rhythm over the next few days. Lucas worked from sunrise to sunset, tackling the jobs that had been neglected since her father's death, fixing fences, reinforcing the barn roof, clearing irrigation ditches. Pearl worked alongside him, grateful for the help but determined not to appear weak or incapable. On the 5th day, Lucas suggested they ride into town for supplies. "I thought you said you couldn't afford anything," Pearl reminded him. "I've got some money saved," Lucas said. "Consider it an investment in the ranch," Pearl's pride bristled. "I don't need charity." "Not charity. A loan. You can pay me back when we're turning a profit." The confidence in his voice that when instead of if made Pearl hesitate before ultimately agreeing. As they rode down the main street of Park City, Pearl was acutely aware of the stares and whispers that followed them. Word had spread quickly about her new ranch hand, and speculation was rampant. "Looks like we're the talk of the town," Lucas remarked, seemingly unbothered by the attention. "People here don't have much to do besides gossip and wait for the next stage from Salt Lake City," Pearl replied, dismounting in front of the general store. Inside, Mr. Emmett greeted them with surprise. "Miss Kincaid, haven't seen you in a spell. And who might this be?" "Lucas Ward," Lucas introduced himself, extending a hand. "Working for Miss Kincaid now." Mr. Emmett's eyebrows shot up. "Is that so? Well, it's good you've got some help out there, Miss Kincaid. That's a lot of ranch for a woman to handle." Pearl bit back a sharp retort, but Lucas spoke before she could. "Miss Kincaid handles it just fine, Mr. Emmett. I'm just lightening the load a bit." The storekeeper looked taken aback by Lucas's firm tone. Of course. What can I get for you folks today?" As they gathered their supplies, Pearl couldn't help but notice how Lucas engaged with everyone they encountered, asking questions about the town, the mines, the ranches in the area. He was gathering information, though for what purpose, she wasn't sure. Their path crossed with Harold Townsend as they were loading their purchases onto their horses. The banker, a portly man with small eyes that reminded Pearl of a hawk, stopped in his tracks. "Miss Kincaid," he said, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "I see you've hired help. Quite an expense for someone in your situation." "Mr. Townsend," Pearl acknowledged coldly. Lucas stepped forward, extending his hand. "Lucas Ward, sir, new foreman at the Kincaid Ranch." Townsend reluctantly shook his hand. "Foreman, my, Miss Kincaid, you are optimistic." "Just practical," Lucas replied smoothly. The Kincaid Ranch has significant potential. With the right management, it could be the most productive property in the valley. Townsend's eyes narrowed. Is that so? Well, I wish you luck, though I fear it may be too little, too late. He looked pointedly at Pearl. My offer still stands, Miss Kincaid. A clean sale, no auction necessary. You could walk away with enough to start fresh somewhere else. That's very generous, Lucas interrupted, but Miss Kincaid won't be selling. In fact, we're expanding operations. Pearl shot Lucas a puzzled look, but he continued confidently. We've just ordered additional breeding stock. By next year, we expect to double our herd. Townsend's face flushed. That seems ambitious. Fortune favors the bold, Mr. Townsend, Lucas replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. You of all people should appreciate that. As they rode back to the ranch, Pearl could no longer contain her confusion. What was that about? Breeding stock, expanding operations. We can barely feed the cattle we have. Lucas looked unconcerned. Townsend needed to hear that we're not just hanging on by a thread. He's like a predator, he can smell weakness. But it's not true. Not yet, Lucas said, his expression suddenly serious. But it could be, Pearl. Your ranch has potential, real potential. But first, we need to get past this debt and the auction. It was the first time he'd used her first name, and Pearl was surprised by how naturally it sounded coming from him. And how exactly do you propose we do that? She asked. Lucas smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his face. I have a plan. The following day, Lucas rode out early, returning just before sundown with a man Pearl recognized as Jonathan Mills, one of the wealthier mine owners in Park City. Mr. Mills has agreed to tour the property, Lucas explained as they dismounted. Pearl, caught off guard and still in her work clothes, gave Lucas a panicked look, but he subtly shook his head, silently asking her to trust him. Over a hastily prepared dinner, Lucas outlined a proposal that left Pearl speechless. He suggested that Mills invest in the Kincaid Ranch as a side venture, specifically in raising horses that could be used in the mines. The mines go through horses like water, Lucas explained. They work them hard in those tunnels, and the poor beasts don't last long. A steady, local supply of good stock would be valuable. Mills nodded thoughtfully. It's true. We're constantly bringing in horses from as far as Denver, costs a fortune in transportation. The Kincaid Ranch has the perfect combination of good grazing land and proximity to the mines, Lucas continued. With some investment, we could establish a breeding program specifically tailored to produce horses suited for mining work. Mills looked at Pearl. Is this something you'd be interested in, Miss Kincaid? Pearl, catching up to Lucas's strategy, nodded. Very much so, Mr. Mills. My father always said our land was perfect for horses. By the time Mills left, he had agreed to consider the proposal and return in a few days with his answer. What just happened? Pearl asked once they were alone. Lucas looked pleased with himself. We just offered Mr. Mills an opportunity to make money while solving a problem for his mines. And if he agrees, we'll have enough to pay off your debt and keep the ranch. But we don't have a horse breeding program. Not yet, Lucas said. But we could. The infrastructure is mostly here already. We'd need to acquire some good breeding stock, build a few more corrals. With what money? Pearl asked, exasperated. Mills's investment would cover that. And once we're established, the profits would be substantial. Pearl shook her head in disbelief. You're either brilliant or completely mad, Lucas grinned. I've been called both. Word of Mills's visit to the Kincaid Ranch spread through Park City like wildfire. The next day, several curious townspeople found reasons to ride past, hoping to glimpse some sign of the rumored new venture. Pearl and Lucas continued working, acting as though nothing unusual was happening. But when Mayor Fletcher himself arrived, accompanied by Townsend, Pearl knew the situation had escalated. "Miss Kincaid," the mayor called out as they approached the barn where Pearl and Lucas were repairing tack. "Might we have a word?" Pearl stepped outside, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mayor Fletcher, Mr. Townsend, what can I do for you? We've heard some interesting rumors," the mayor began, his eyes darting around the property. "Something about Jonathan Mills investing in your ranch." "Mr. Mills and I have discussed some business opportunities," Pearl said carefully, following Lucas's advice to neither confirm nor deny anything specific. Townsend stepped forward. "Miss Kincaid, I feel obligated to warn you against making any hasty decisions. Business ventures require experience, connections, all of which Miss Kincaid has in abundance," Lucas interrupted, emerging from the barn. "Her father built one of the finest ranches in the territory. She grew up learning the business from the ground up." Townsend's face darkened. "And you are?" "Lucas Ward, foreman of the Kincaid Ranch," Lucas replied, extending his hand with deliberate politeness. The mayor cleared his throat. "Yes, well, we're simply concerned about Miss Kincaid's welfare. These sorts of ventures can be risky." "Life is risky, Mayor," Pearl said, finding courage in Lucas's steady presence beside her. "But I appreciate your concern." After they left, Pearl turned to Lucas. "They're worried." "Good," Lucas replied with satisfaction. "They should be." 3 days later, Jonathan Mills returned with his lawyer. By sunset, papers were signed. Mills would invest $500 in the Kincaid Ranch for a 20% share of the horse breeding operation. The money would be delivered within the week, well before the auction deadline. That evening, Pearl and Lucas sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The weight that had been crushing Pearl's chest for weeks had finally lifted. "I can't believe you pulled this off," she said softly. "Why did you help me? The truth this time." Lucas was quiet for a long moment. "My family had a ranch in Texas," he finally said. "When my father died, the bank foreclosed before my mother could even finish mourning. We had 3 days to pack our belongings and leave the only home I'd ever known." Pearl felt a surge of empathy. "What happened to your mother?" "She died 2 years later, working as a laundress in a mining town much like this one." His voice was matter-of-fact, but Pearl could hear the old pain beneath the words. "I'm sorry," she said simply. Lucas shrugged. "It was a long time ago. But I swore I'd never let another family lose their land to a banker's greed if I could help it." Pearl studied his profile in the fading light. "So you just travel around, saving ranches?" That drew a laugh from him. "Hardly. I've worked many jobs, cowhand, horse trainer, even tried my hand at prospecting. But when I heard people in Salt Lake City talking about the widow up in Park City who was about to lose her ranch—" "I'm not a widow," Pearl corrected automatically. "No," Lucas agreed, his eyes finding hers. "You're much more interesting than that." The next morning, Pearl rode into town alone to pay Townsend. The banker's face fell when she counted out the full amount of the debt onto his desk. "Where did you get this money?" he demanded, unable to hide his disappointment. "That's not your concern, Mr. Townsend," Pearl replied calmly. "What matters is that my debt is now paid in full. I trust you'll remove my property from the auction list immediately." Townsend's lips pressed into a thin line as he reluctantly wrote out a receipt. "This doesn't change anything in the long run, Miss Kincaid. Running a ranch is a man's job. Sooner or later you'll be back in my office, looking for another loan." Pearl took the receipt, folding it carefully and placing it in her pocket. "I wouldn't count on that, Mr. Townsend." As Pearl left the bank, she felt dozens of eyes on her. The town had been so certain of her failure that her success left them stunned. She walked with her head high to the general store, where she purchased supplies with a confidence she hadn't felt in months. Mr. Emmett was notably more respectful than during her previous visit. "Heard you paid off your loan, Miss Kincaid, and that you're starting a horse breeding operation with Jonathan Mills." "News travels fast," Pearl commented, selecting a bag of coffee beans, a small luxury she'd been denying herself. "It's a small town," Emmett replied. "People are saying that foreman of yours is quite the businessman." Pearl smiled. "Mr. Ward has been very helpful." "Will he be staying on, then? Permanently?" The question gave Pearl pause. She and Lucas hadn't discussed what would happen now that the immediate crisis was averted. The thought of him leaving created an unexpected hollow feeling in her chest. "That remains to be seen," she answered non-committally. When Pearl returned to the ranch, she found Lucas in the south pasture, studying the terrain with a focused expression. "This would be a good place for the new corrals," he said as she approached. "Good drainage, sheltered from the north wind." Pearl dismounted, coming to stand beside him. "You're still planning as though you'll be here to see it built." Lucas turned to her, his expression suddenly uncertain. "Would you prefer I leave? Now that the debt's paid, you could hire a proper foreman." "Is that what you want?" Pearl asked, surprised by how vulnerable the question made her feel. "No," Lucas said simply. "I'd like to see this through, build something here." Relief flooded through Pearl. "I'd like that too." Over the next few weeks, word spread throughout the territory about the Kincaid Ranch's new venture. Lucas's business acumen combined with Pearl's knowledge of the land and livestock created a partnership that quickly began to show results. They acquired their first breeding horses, 2 stallions with strong legs and broad chests, ideal for the harsh work in the mines, and 8 mares with similar qualities. The animals represented a significant investment, but Lucas had negotiated favorable terms with a breeder in Salt Lake City, who was interested in maintaining a business relationship. As they worked side by side, Pearl found herself watching Lucas when he wasn't looking, the way his hands moved confidently over the horses, how his eyes crinkled when he laughed, the quiet competence that seemed to radiate from him. She caught him watching her too, his gaze quickly shifting away when she turned in his direction. Their days fell into a comfortable pattern. Up before dawn to feed the animals and check the property, working through the day on the endless tasks a ranch required, then sharing simple meals in the evening before collapsing into exhausted sleep. But despite the hard work, Pearl found herself happier than she'd been since her father's death. Lucas seemed to take particular pleasure in their weekly trips to town, where he made a point of greeting Townsend and the mayor with exaggerated politeness, always dropping casual mentions of the ranch's progress. "Mr. Townsend." "Just the man I wanted to see," he called out one afternoon, steering Pearl toward the banker who was clearly trying to avoid them. "Miss Kincaid and I were just discussing the possibility of acquiring the Webster property adjacent to ours. Would your bank be interested in extending a loan for such a purchase? With proper collateral, of course." Townsend's face flushed. "The Webster property isn't for sale." "No, that's not what Mr. Webster told us yesterday," Lucas replied innocently. He seemed quite eager to discuss terms. As they walked away, Pearl gave Lucas a questioning look. "The Webster property." "Just keeping Townsend on his toes," Lucas replied with a wink. "The more successful we appear, the more it irritates him." Pearl laughed despite herself. "You really do enjoy rubbing their noses in it, don't you?" "Every single day," Lucas confirmed with a grin that made Pearl's heart skip a beat. Their growing success didn't go unnoticed by the rest of the town either. People who had once barely acknowledged Pearl now greeted her warmly, asking after the ranch and expressing interest in her venture. Some were genuine in their changed attitudes. Others were clearly trying to position themselves favorably with what was becoming one of the more promising businesses in the area. Pearl took it all in stride, neither holding grudges nor completely trusting the sudden friendliness. Lucas was less forgiving, maintaining a polite but cool demeanor toward those who had been quick to write Pearl off. "They didn't believe in you when it mattered," he said one evening as they discussed an invitation to dine with the mayor and his wife. "Why reward them with your company now?" Pearl considered his words. "It's not about rewarding them, it's about building connections that could benefit the ranch." Lucas nodded reluctantly. "You're right, of course. Just don't forget who your real friends are." "I won't," Pearl promised, her eyes holding his for a moment longer than necessary. As summer faded into autumn, the ranch underwent a transformation. New corrals rose in the south pasture. The barn was expanded to accommodate the growing herd, and 2 additional hands were hired to help with the increasing workload. Jonathan Mills proved to be a valuable partner, not only providing the initial investment, but also introducing Pearl and Lucas to other mine owners interested in securing a reliable source of horses. By October, they had advance orders for all the horses they expected to have ready by the following spring. One crisp afternoon, as golden light slanted across the land, Lucas found Pearl sitting on the fence of the new corral, watching the mares graze. "Beautiful sight, isn't it?" he asked, leaning against the fence beside her. Pearl nodded. "I keep thinking about how proud my father would be. He always believed this land was special." "He was right," Lucas said softly, "though I think he'd be even more proud of you." Pearl turned to look at him, struck by the sincerity in his voice. "Thank you for saying that." "I mean it," Lucas said, his eyes serious. "What you've accomplished here, Pearl, it's remarkable. Most men couldn't have done it, let alone a woman facing the kind of opposition you had." "We did it together," Pearl corrected him. "You were doing it before I arrived," Lucas pointed out. "I just helped speed things along." A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the occasional soft nickering of the horses and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. "There's a harvest dance in town next weekend," Lucas said eventually, his voice casual though his fingers tapped an anxious rhythm against the fence rail. "Thought you might like to go." Pearl felt a flutter in her stomach. "Are you asking to escort me, Mr. Ward?" "I believe I am, Miss Kincaid," he replied, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Then I accept," Pearl said, her own smile breaking through. The night of the harvest dance arrived clear and cool, with stars scattered like diamonds across the velvet sky. Pearl spent more time than usual getting ready. Wearing her best dress, a blue calico that her father had given her for her 21st birthday, and arranging her hair in a style more elaborate than her usual practical braid. When she emerged from her bedroom, Lucas was waiting in the front room, dressed in a clean white shirt and dark vest, his usual work clothes replaced by his Sunday best. He stared at her for a long moment before speaking. "You look beautiful," he said simply. Pearl felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "Thank you. You clean up rather well yourself." The community hall was decorated with autumn leaves and harvest bounty pumpkins, corn stalks, and bales of hay, creating a festive atmosphere. A small band played lively tunes, and couples were already dancing when Pearl and Lucas arrived. Their entrance caused a stir. The success of the Kincaid ranch was now the talk of the territory, and Lucas's role in that success had transformed him from suspicious stranger to respected businessman in the eyes of the town. Men nodded respectfully as they passed, while women whispered behind their hands, eyeing both Pearl and Lucas with new interest. Mayor Fletcher approached them immediately, his wife on his arm. "Miss Kincaid, Mr. Ward, so pleased you could join us tonight." "Wouldn't have missed it, Mayor," Lucas replied smoothly, his hand resting lightly on the small of Pearl's back in a gesture that felt both protective and possessive. "We've been hearing wonderful things about your operation," Mrs. Fletcher gushed. "They say you'll be supplying horses to mines as far away as Bingham Canyon." "Word travels fast," Pearl commented with a smile. "Success always does," the mayor said, his tone indicating he was trying to align himself with that success. "I always said the Kincaid property had tremendous potential. Your father had a good eye for land." Lucas's expression remained pleasant, but Pearl could sense his tension. "Indeed he did. If you'll excuse us, I believe this is our dance." As Lucas led her to the dance floor, Pearl couldn't help but laugh. "You really can't stand him, can you? The man practically celebrated when he thought you'd lose the ranch," Lucas replied, taking her hand in his as they joined the other dancers. "Now he wants to pretend he supported you all along." "People change," Pearl suggested, though without much conviction. "People reveal themselves," Lucas corrected. "Difficult times show who someone truly is. Remember that." As they moved through the steps of the dance, Pearl was acutely aware of Lucas's proximity, his hand warm on her waist, his eyes never leaving hers. He was an unexpectedly good dancer, guiding her confidently through the figures. "Where did you learn to dance like this?" she asked as he twirled her. A shadow passed briefly over his face. "My mother insisted I learn. Said a gentleman should know how to dance properly." "She was right," Pearl said softly. They danced several more dances before stepping outside for some air. The night was cool and clear, the stars brilliant overhead. "Quite a change from a few months ago," Lucas observed, looking back at the hall where people who had once whispered about Pearl's inevitable failure now spoke admiringly of her vision and determination. "Thanks to you," Pearl said. Lucas shook his head. "No. I may have helped with the strategy, but the heart of it all was you, Pearl. Your courage, your refusal to give up." Pearl turned to face him fully. "Why do you always do that? Deflect any credit for what you've accomplished?" Lucas seemed taken aback by the question. "I don't, you do," Pearl insisted. "You've transformed my failing ranch into a thriving business, yet you act as though you've done nothing remarkable." Lucas was quiet for a moment. "Perhaps because this is the first time I've built something instead of just moving on. It's unfamiliar territory." The vulnerability in his voice touched Pearl deeply. Before she could respond, the door to the hall opened, and Harold Townsend emerged, his face flushed from dancing or drink or perhaps both. "Well, well," he said, his voice slightly slurred. "The miracle workers of Park City." Lucas stiffened beside Pearl. "Mr. Townsend, enjoying the festivities?" Townsend ignored him, focusing on Pearl. "You know, Miss Kincaid, I've been thinking. Perhaps I was too hasty in my assessment of your situation. A woman of your capabilities might be worth reconsidering." Pearl raised an eyebrow. "Reconsidering as a potential wife," Townsend clarified as though it should have been obvious. "You've proven you can manage a household or, in this case, a ranch. That's an admirable quality in a spouse." Lucas took a step forward, but Pearl placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Mr. Townsend," she said coolly, "I'm flattered by your proposal, misguided as it is, but I must decline. You see, I prefer a partner who believes in me even when times are difficult, not one who only sees my value when I've already succeeded." Townsend's face darkened. "You're making a mistake. Ward here is nothing but a drifter. He'll be gone with the first snow, mark my words." "Good night, Mr. Townsend," Pearl said firmly, taking Lucas's arm and turning back toward the dance hall. As they walked away, Lucas looked down at her with a mixture of admiration and something deeper, more complex. "You handled that well." "I've had practice dealing with unwanted attention," Pearl replied with a shrug. "Have you had many proposals?" Lucas asked, his tone carefully casual. Pearl smiled slightly. A few, none that interested me. And what would interest you in a proposal? Lucas asked, stopping to face her. Pearl met his gaze steadily. Someone who sees me as an equal, someone who doesn't want to change me or control me, someone who... She hesitated, then finished softly, someone who looks at me the way you're looking at me right now. Lucas's expression softened. And how am I looking at you? Like I'm something precious, Pearl whispered. Lucas reached out slowly, giving her time to step back if she wanted to, and brushed a stray curl from her face. You are something precious, Pearl Kincaid. The moment stretched between them, full of possibility. Then Lucas leaned down and kissed her, his lips gentle against hers. Pearl closed her eyes, her heart pounding as she returned the kiss, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Lucas rested his forehead against hers. I've been wanting to do that for weeks, Pearl smiled. What took you so long? Wasn't sure you felt the same way, Lucas admitted. For a smart businessman, you can be remarkably blind sometimes, Pearl teased. They returned to the dance, moving together with a new awareness of each other. The evening took on a dreamlike quality for Pearl. Every touch, every glance charged with meaning. As they rode home under the stars, Pearl found herself wondering about the future. Lucas had never explicitly said he intended to stay permanently, and despite their growing closeness, she was afraid to assume. Penny for your thoughts, Lucas said, noticing her silence. Pearl hesitated before responding. Townsend said you'd leave when winter comes. Is he right? Lucas reined his horse to a stop, prompting Pearl to do the same. In the moonlight, his expression was serious. You want me to stay? He asked. Yes, Pearl answered without hesitation, but only if you want to. I've spent most of my adult life drifting from place to place, Lucas said thoughtfully, never staying long enough to put down roots. But this place, he looked around at the shadowed landscape. This place feels different. You feel different. Different how? Pearl pressed, needing to hear the words. Like home, Lucas said simply, like somewhere I belong. Pearl felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. Then stay. As your foreman, Lucas asked, a teasing note in his voice. Pearl smiled. That depends on whether you have something else in mind. Lucas urged his horse closer to hers, reaching across to take her hand. I might have a few ideas. Winter descended on Park City with a fury, blanketing the mountains and valleys with snow and bringing bitter winds that howled around the corners of the ranch house. But inside, warmth and hope flourished. Lucas formally proposed to Pearl on Christmas Eve, presenting her with a simple gold ring that had belonged to his mother. They were married on New Year's Day in the small church in town, with Jonathan Mills standing as Lucas's best man and Mrs. Emmett, the shopkeeper's wife who had always been kind to Pearl, serving as her matron of honor. The town turned out in force for the wedding, partly out of genuine goodwill but largely out of curiosity. The transformation of the failing Kincaid ranch into one of the most promising enterprises in the territory had become something of a legend, with Lucas and Pearl at its center. Harold Townsend and Mayor Fletcher were notably absent from the celebration, a fact that caused Lucas to smile with satisfaction when it was pointed out to him. Some wounds to pride never heal, he commented to Pearl as they greeted their guests at the reception held in the community hall. Does it bother you? Pearl asked, concerned that lingering resentments might affect their business. Lucas shook his head. Not in the least. Their opposition makes our success all the sweeter. The winter months passed in a haze of happiness for Pearl. Marriage to Lucas was everything she had hoped for and more. He treated her as a true partner, consulting her on all decisions regarding the ranch and respecting her knowledge and experience. Their evenings were spent planning for the spring breeding season and the expansion of their operation, or simply enjoying each other's company by the fire. By February, their first foals began arriving, healthy and strong, promising a good crop for the coming year's sales. Lucas spent hours in the barn, checking on the mares and their offspring, his dedication to the horses matching Pearl's own. When the spring thaw finally came, bringing with it new growth and renewed activity, the Kincaid, now the Ward Ranch, was ready. The corrals were full of horses, the pastures were greening, and the future looked bright. Their reputation had spread beyond Park City, attracting buyers from mining operations throughout Utah Territory and even beyond. Lucas handled the business negotiations with skill, while Pearl oversaw the breeding program, selecting traits that would produce horses particularly suited for the harsh conditions of mining work. A year after Lucas had first ridden onto her property, Pearl stood on the porch of the ranch house, watching as he demonstrated a young gelding's abilities for a potential buyer. The horse responded beautifully to Lucas's commands, showing off the strength and steady temperament that had become hallmarks of their breeding program. "Impressive animal," Jonathan Mills commented, joining Pearl on the porch. "You two have built something remarkable here." Pearl smiled with pride. "Thank you for taking a chance on us, Jonathan," Mills shrugged. "Best investment I ever made, though I suspect your husband would have found a way to succeed with or without my help." "Perhaps," Pearl agreed. "But it meant a lot to have someone believe in us when the rest of the town was just waiting for us to fail." "Speaking of the town," Mills said with a chuckle, "did you hear about Townsend?" Pearl shook her head. "He's selling the bank. Moving to Denver, apparently. Claims Park City has become too competitive for his tastes." Pearl couldn't help the satisfaction that washed over her at the news. "Is that so?" "Indeed," Mills confirmed. "Mayor Fletcher's quite upset about it. He relied heavily on Townsend's financial backing for his various ventures." Later that evening, Pearl shared the news with Lucas as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Lucas laughed heartily. "Townsend's leaving. That's the best news I've heard all week. You really do enjoy seeing him squirm, don't you?" Pearl asked, though she couldn't keep the amusement from her voice. "I enjoy seeing justice," Lucas corrected. "That man would have taken everything you worked for without a second thought. The fact that he's now leaving town with his tail between his legs is satisfying." Pearl leaned against his shoulder, content. "Do you ever think about how differently things might have turned out if you hadn't ridden in that day?" Lucas put his arm around her. "I try not to. The thought of this place in Townsend's hands, or you having to leave the only home you've known." He shook his head. "No, I prefer to think about how things are now, not what might have been." "And how are things now, Mr. Ward?" Pearl asked teasingly. Lucas kissed the top of her head. "Perfect, Mrs. Ward. Absolutely perfect." 2 years after their wedding, the Ward Ranch had firmly established itself as the premier horse breeding operation in northern Utah. Their reputation for producing strong, intelligent horses suited for mining work had spread throughout the mountain states, and demand consistently exceeded their supply. They had expanded the original Kincaid property, purchasing the neighboring Webster land when it finally did come up for sale. The additional acreage allowed them to increase their breeding stock and improve their grazing rotation, ensuring healthier horses and more sustainable land management. Pearl and Lucas worked side by side, their partnership in business as strong as their partnership in marriage. They complemented each other perfectly, Lucas's business acumen and strategic thinking, balanced by Pearl's deep knowledge of horses and ranch management. Their personal happiness was completed by the birth of their son, Thomas, a sturdy, curious boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's determined spirit. At 18 months old, he was already showing a natural affinity for horses, squealing with delight whenever Lucas placed him on the back of a gentle mare. One spring morning, as Pearl was working with a particularly spirited young filly in the training corral, she spotted a familiar figure riding up the lane, Mayor Fletcher, his posture stiff and his expression grim. Pearl handed the filly's lead rope to one of their hands and went to meet the visitor. "Mayor Fletcher, this is a surprise." The mayor dismounted awkwardly. He had aged considerably in the past few years, his once robust frame now slightly stooped, his hair more gray than brown. "Miss Kincaid, Mrs. Ward, I was hoping to speak with you and your husband." "Lucas is in the barn," Pearl said, gesturing for the mayor to follow her. "May I ask what this is about?" Fletcher cleared his throat. "A business proposition. They found Lucas in the barn office, reviewing breeding records." He looked up in surprise at their visitor, then rose to his feet with deliberate slowness. "Mayor, what brings you to our ranch?" Fletcher removed his hat, twisting it nervously in his hands. "I've come to ask for your help. The town council is considering establishing a regular stage-coach route between Park City and Salt Lake City. We would need reliable horses and someone to manage them." Lucas leaned back against the desk, his expression neutral. "And you thought of us? You're the most successful horse operation in the territory," Fletcher said, a note of reluctance in his voice. "It would be foolish to look elsewhere." Pearl exchanged a glance with Lucas, reading the satisfaction in his eyes. 3 years ago, this same man had been certain of her failure. Now he was practically begging for their assistance. "It's an interesting proposition," Lucas said carefully. "We'd need to discuss the details, of course. The number of horses required, the maintenance arrangements, compensation." Of course," Fletcher agreed quickly. "The council is prepared to be generous. Your involvement would lend considerable prestige to the project." "We'll consider it," Pearl said, stepping forward, "though our current commitments to the mines must take priority." Fletcher nodded eagerly. "Naturally. We understand how in demand your services are. That's why we're approaching you now, before the route is formally announced." After the mayor left, Lucas pulled Pearl into his arms, laughing softly. "Did you see his face? The man could barely bring himself to ask for our help." Pearl smiled against his chest. "You're enjoying this far too much." "I told you I'd rub their noses in it," Lucas reminded her. "Every single day." "And so you have," Pearl agreed, pulling back to look at him. "Though I'm starting to think your vendetta against the town might be getting a bit old. It's been 3 years after all." Lucas considered this. "Perhaps you're right," though watching Fletcher squirm was immensely satisfying. "So, should we take on the stagecoach contract?" Pearl asked. Lucas nodded thoughtfully. "It's a good opportunity. Diversifies our business, creates more stability. Plus, it would mean our horses would be the first thing visitors see when they arrive in Park City. Another way to showcase our success," Pearl noted with amusement. "Exactly," Lucas agreed, unabashed. "Though these days, I'm less interested in proving the town wrong and more focused on building something for Thomas to inherit someday." As if summoned by his name, their son's delighted laughter floated in from outside, where he was being entertained by one of the ranch hands. "He's going to grow up very different from either of us," Pearl observed softly. "Secure, loved, with a place that's truly his." Lucas's expression grew serious. "That's all I want for him. To never know the uncertainty I grew up with or face the kind of opposition you did." Pearl reached up to touch his face gently. "We've done well, haven't we? Built something good here." "Something very good," Lucas agreed, covering her hand with his own. "Though the best part of it all is sharing it with you." That evening, as twilight settled over the ranch and Thomas slept peacefully in his small bed, Pearl and Lucas sat on the porch swing, a habit they had maintained throughout their marriage. The air was sweet with the scent of spring blossoms, and the distant mountains stood purple against the darkening sky. "I got a letter from Jonathan today," Lucas mentioned, his arm around Pearl's shoulders. "He's considering retiring from the mining business. Wants to know if we'd be interested in buying out his share of the ranch." Pearl turned to look at him. "What did you tell him?" "That we'd think about it," Lucas replied. "Though I'm inclined to say yes, it feels right to have the ranch completely in our hands." Pearl nodded in agreement. "It would be fitting. Full circle from when you first rode in and found me about to lose everything." Lucas smiled at the memory. "You were so suspicious of me." "With good reason," Pearl countered. "Strange man rides up offering to work for free. Anyone would be suspicious." "Fair point," Lucas conceded with a laugh, "though I like to think my intentions were honorable." "Eventually," Pearl teased. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the swing creaking gently as Lucas pushed it with his foot. "I've been thinking," Pearl said eventually. "About expanding again." Lucas raised an eyebrow. "More land," Pearl shook her head. "More family. Thomas should have a brother or sister, don't you think?" Lucas's face lit up with joy. "Are you?" "Not yet," Pearl clarified, "but I thought we might work on it." Lucas pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I think that's an excellent business strategy, Mrs. Ward." 5 years later, the Ward Ranch was known throughout the West as a model of success and innovation. Their breeding program had expanded beyond horses for mining to include animals specifically bred for stagecoach routes, cavalry mounts, and even pleasure riding for wealthy Eastern visitors who had begun to discover the natural beauty of Utah Territory. Their family had grown as well. Thomas, now 6, was joined by his sister Sarah, 4, and another brother James, just celebrating his first birthday. The ranch house had been expanded to accommodate the growing family, though Pearl had insisted on maintaining the charm and character of her childhood home. On a warm summer evening, as the children played in the yard under the watchful eye of their nursemaid, Pearl and Lucas hosted a dinner for several prominent citizens of Park City and visitors from as far away as Denver. The occasion was the 10th anniversary of Lucas's arrival at the ranch, though few besides the couple themselves recognized the significance of the date. Among the guests were Jonathan Mills, now retired but still a close friend, several mine owners who had been early customers, and even Mayor Fletcher, whose attitude toward the Wards had evolved from contempt to grudging respect to outright admiration, as their success and influence in the territory had grown. As Lucas stood to propose a toast, Pearl watched him with pride and love. He had changed over the years. The restless energy that had once driven him had mellowed into a steady confidence. The chip on his shoulder regarding the town's initial rejection had faded into occasional good-humored teasing rather than active resentment. "To good friends and good fortune," Lucas said, raising his glass. "And to my wife, Pearl, without whom none of this would have been possible." After the guests had departed, Pearl and Lucas walked hand in hand to the corral where their first breeding horses had been kept. Many of those original animals were now retired to easy duty or sold to good homes, replaced by their offspring and new bloodlines that Pearl had carefully selected. 10 years, Pearl marveled, leaning against the fence. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday that you rode up to the house, offering to work for nothing but meals." Lucas smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling. "Best decision I ever made." "Even though you had to endure years of Townsend and Fletcher looking down their noses at you?" Pearl asked. Lucas laughed. "Especially because of that. The looks on their faces when we succeeded, worth every moment of hardship. Pearl shook her head fondly. You really did rub it in their faces daily, just like you promised. And I'd do it all again, Lucas said, pulling her into his arms. Though these days I find I care less about proving the town wrong and more about making you proud. I am proud, Pearl assured him, resting her head against his chest, of the ranch, of our family, of us. Lucas kissed the top of her head. So am I, Pearl, so am I. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, Pearl reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the brink of losing everything to building a legacy that would endure for generations. It had been a path filled with challenges, triumphs, and above all, love. The town that had once watched her fail now pointed to the Ward Ranch as an example of what determination and vision could accomplish. The banker who had tried to take her land now worked for a larger institution in Denver, his ambitions thwarted by the very woman he had underestimated. And the drifter who had arrived with nothing but confidence and a desire to help had found a home, a family, and a purpose that fulfilled him more than he had ever thought possible. As they walked back to the house where their children waited for good-night kisses and bedtime stories, Pearl squeezed Lucas's hand. "Thank you," she said simply. Lucas looked down at her, his eyes reflecting the last light of day. "For what?" "For riding into my life when I needed you most," Pearl replied. "For believing in me when no one else did." "You've more than repaid that faith," Lucas assured her. "You gave me a home, a family, a future. Everything I never knew I wanted until I found you." In the distance, the lights of Park City twinkled in the gathering darkness. The town that had once dismissed Pearl Kincaid now overshadowed by the success of the Ward Ranch. But as they crossed the threshold of their home, greeted by the joyful cries of their children and the warmth of hearth and heart, neither Pearl nor Lucas spared a thought for old grudges or past slights. They had built something far more valuable than mere success. They had created a legacy of love, determination, and mutual respect that would endure long after the petty judgments of the town were forgotten. And in the end, that was the sweetest victory of all.